Hi, this is CEO Swapnil Bhartiya, and today we have with us Jankiram, MSV, Principal Analyst at Jankiram Associate. Jani, it's great to have you on the show.
Hi, Swapnil. Great to be on your show.
Today we are going to talk about Microsoft Ignite 2023 that took place last week. I would like to hear from you, from your perspective, when you put your analyst hat on. What were some of the key takeaways from this event?
Microsoft just concluded Ignite last week, and a lot of things came out of that. But we'll focus on a few things. The first one that caught my attention is how Microsoft is attempting to recreate the magic of platform all over again with AI. I worked at Microsoft almost a decade ago, and I spent about 11 years at Microsoft. So I know the platform DNA that Microsoft carries and how they want to capitalize on that. So historically, Microsoft is known to build very successful platforms that resulted in ecosystems. For example, the whole Windows Visual Studio and the .NET platforms have created tremendous impact on the industry. There are like tens of thousands of developers who built careers around that. But Microsoft missed the bus when it came to mobile, and it let Google and Apple dominate that market. But Satya now doesn't want that to happen with AI. So he is making sure that Microsoft is firing from all cylinders to build a brand new platform all over again and repeat the magic of Windows and .NET and Visual Studio with AI. So what it really means. So the new stack that Microsoft is visualizing and explaining to the ecosystem is Azure as the new operating system of AI. But if Azure is the new operating system, that needs to have a hardware. We'll come to that in a minute. But the kernel of this new operating system that Microsoft is building is the LLM or the generative AI foundation models. So that is going to be the kernel, Azure as the operating system, and then we are going to have AI as the whole new runtime, which is based on Azure AI, Azure ML, and then guess what? Copilots are the new apps. Now, Microsoft is building a set of copilots, and it is also letting customers, solution providers, SIs, and ISVs build additional copilots, and that is going to be a marketplace. So this is a very similar approach that Microsoft has historically taken to create a platform story, and now that is going to be repeated with AI all over again.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that analysis. And you mentioned hardware, and I feel that hardware, you talked about Apple and Google, not just the mobile phones, but our Ring doorbells, smart speakers, car plays, they're everywhere. And next year with the Vision Pro, we'll see a new breed of devices. Where is Microsoft when it comes to hardware?
So Microsoft has a very successful hardware business in the form of Xbox and even the recent Surface that they have shipped. But what Microsoft has been lacking is the silicon on its cloud. And if you look at Google, it's aggressively investing in TPUs, the tensor processing units, and Amazon acquired Annapurna Labs a while ago, and they have a very successful Graviton Inferentia Trinium family of processors. Microsoft is a bit late to the party, but nevertheless, now they have the entire family of processors in the form of CPU, which is Azure Cobalt. Now, Azure Cobalt is the brand new CPU that Microsoft is building based on ARM. It basically has a 64-bit and a 128-core chip. And Microsoft claims that this new CPU that Azure VMs will run on top of will deliver 40% more performance. And already Microsoft is running a part of Microsoft Teams and SQL Server on top of this new processor, which is pretty interesting. So the Azure Cobalt is joining an existing ARM processor called Neoverse N1 that Microsoft bought from Ampere Computing a couple of years ago. So this is actually the second type of ARM instance that shows up on Azure. And what's interesting is this is not just licensed from a third party, but this is a Microsoft's chip, a CPU that it has built based on the ARM architecture, which is pretty interesting. And then obviously the whole GPU story is evolving, and there is tremendous shortage of GPUs in the market. So Microsoft has gone ahead and built its own GPU, which is going to be an alternative to NVIDIA's state-of-the-art GPUs, and this is called Azure Maya. And this comes with 105 billion transistors, and technically replaces the FPGA or the ASIC, or more commonly known as the GPU, which is like a purpose-built processor to accelerate training and inference of foundation models. And this is going to be significant because Microsoft will reduce its dependency on NVIDIA. Obviously, the cost will come down, and then it will start leveraging this hardware and train new models. So this is going to be a very strategic investment for Microsoft, which will go a long way in its AI success story in the coming years. And finally, there is DPU, which is the data processing unit. And DPUs have been getting a lot of attention because they typically offload the compute, which is in the form of hypervisor, storage drivers and storage accelerators, and network management, leaving it to the CPU and the operating system combination. We offload that to a purpose-built processor, which is called the DPU. NVIDIA has been talking about something called Bluefield, which is available with VMware in collaboration with NVIDIA. And Amazon has been building Nitro, AWS Nitro. And now Microsoft has a very similar technology in the form of Azure Boost, which is going to basically offload the mundane, heavy lifting and undifferentiated processing of managing hypervisors, managing storage and network to a purpose-built processor. Now what it does is it basically frees up the CPU to deliver additional performance and get better performance to run workloads. So you are essentially removing that the overhead of managing non-workload processing from CPU, and you are moving that to DPU, and that is Azure Boost. And this comes from an acquisition that Microsoft has done earlier this year from Fungible. So Microsoft acquired this SmartNIC company called Fungible, and they have rebranded the IP and the technology that Fungible offers as Azure Boost. So if you look at this, they now have, or at least going to have, a CPU, GPU, and then a DPU, the data processing unit. And this pretty much covers the entire story.
Today, developers, they also need access to devices, hardware in their hand. Of course, going to the cloud is okay. And that's when we look at Apple, Google, of course, Amazon. So far, they don't have, devices that folks can play with. Do you also see, when you said, they kind of missed the mobile bus, but they don't want to miss the AI buzz. How about the new platform that folks are consuming? As Satya also talked about, they missed, mobile phones. So do you also see, because Microsoft HoloLens, that was a promising technology when it comes to VR, and depending on how you look at things, Apple might rekindle interest in VR next year. Do you also see any signs from Microsoft that they will enter these core markets also? Because if these things are not in the hands of users and developers, that can also be kind of losing, a lot of other markets.
Very interesting point. But my understanding is Microsoft has pretty much given up and walked away from doing anything with mobile. They would never enter the handset market again. But they are very keen on the edge computing, industrial edge and IoT market. So what it means is the new DPUs, GPUs that we are talking about will eventually show up on Azure Stack. And that is going to be the Microsoft hardware, which goes beyond Azure, the cloud platform, to run outside of it in the form of Azure Stack or Azure Edge computing devices. But that's not necessarily a consumer device, but it's meant for enterprises and particularly industrial automation based customers who will leverage that. But what's interesting is the other point that Satya made during his keynote. He talked about Microsoft's foundation models running at variety of endpoints. Now by endpoints, he actually meant Windows, Mac, iPhone and Android. So While Microsoft may not really build or rebuild a mobile phone, they are going to bring their copilot to all these platforms. And these copilots are going to be based on Microsoft's own foundation models. So they may not really control the chips, the processors, but what they'll do is they'll actually optimize their foundation models for each of these endpoints. So I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft ships a copilot for Apple Mac, or an LLM that's optimized for Android. So that is going to be where Microsoft will really have a push, but not necessarily on the consumer front or the consumer side of things.
Now, let's talk about OpenAI. I don't want to talk about the recent development that is happening at OpenAI, but I want to talk about OpenAI announcement or what you see is happening in the Azure space and also at the event.
The market dynamics are very interesting. It's very volatile, but I want to focus precisely on what came out of Ignite, and let's stick to that. So Microsoft and OpenAI has a very unique relationship. It's more complicated now, but they have a very unique relationship. So the deal is OpenAI will innovate and releases their foundation models in the wild, and then Microsoft will deliver an enterprise version or an enterprise flavor of OpenAI foundation models. So that's the deal between OpenAI and Microsoft. The innovation happens rapidly at OpenAI, and Microsoft figures out what it means to enterprises and how to securely and confidently deliver that to enterprise customers. So you'll actually see more and more OpenAI models showing up on Azure. But what is also interesting is Microsoft understands that the models like GPT-4 are too large, too big, and too heavy to do anything with devices and personal computing. So they are very clear that they need to work with companies like Meta to make sure that they also build a set of foundation models that run outside of the cloud. So it's very interesting that Microsoft has partnered with Meta, and now they are bringing Llama to maybe Windows and other devices. But what's very interesting is Microsoft is also bringing their own foundation models. Now, we are familiar with large language model. What Microsoft research is focusing on is small language models or smart language models called the SLMs. And these SLMs are precisely targeted at Windows. For example, there are two models called Phi 1.5 and Phi 2, which come with so they have about 1.3 billion parameters and 2.7 billion parameters, and they are designed to run on Windows and maybe eventually on Mac OS. So again, talking about foundation models, Microsoft has invested in a vision model called Florence, which is like DALL-E, but it is much more sophisticated, and Microsoft is already integrating that with Azure Cognitive Services. And at Ignite, Satya announced a bunch of new models showing up on Azure Model Catalog, all the way from Stable Diffusion to Falcon to Llama to Fires, which is actually an Arabic LLM, which is pretty interesting, and even other LLMs like Mistral, which is pretty new. So if you look at Microsoft's strategy when it comes to foundation models, they're very clear. They have three different categories or families. One is big bet on OpenAI, that's not going away anywhere. Second is homegrown models coming out of Microsoft research. They are small, optimized for Windows and other operating systems. Then the whole ecosystem of the open source or the open foundation models that are developed by Meta and the other open source vendors. And Azure will be the platform to run any of these models. So that is the strategy of Microsoft, which is very unique.
So basically, if you look at across the board, it's not about Microsoft's own hardware and platform anymore. It's like platform or really agnostic. Wherever you are, Microsoft technologies will be there. It doesn't matter whether you're on a cloud, edge, Apple devices, Google devices, or Microsoft devices. Is that correct?
Absolutely. See, we saw how Microsoft attempted that with Cortana, right? So when conversational AI and voice agents were popular, Microsoft attempted that with Cortana. So you had Alexa, you had Siri, you had Cortana, but Microsoft didn't really get any kind of adoption or momentum with Cortana. But now with copilots, Copilot is the new Alexa or Siri or Cortana. So Microsoft is very clear that they want their copilots to be the de facto. And oh, when I said Siri, my watch has picked up the cue.
Happens all the
so
time.
coming so coming back, yeah, so Microsoft believes copilots are the new apps or the new agents that it can run on non-Microsoft devices. So to make that happen, they need to have smaller language models that they can push to Android phones, iPhones, and so on. So that's a very smart strategy because they have investments, they have already built copilots for the cloud. Now they need to optimize it and minimize it to run on devices. So it's copilots everywhere. That is the vision of Microsoft.
Now let's talk about data platform for generative AI, because we are talking about AI either way. So talk about the general availability of Microsoft Fabric and of course Graph AI API.
When you actually look at LLMs and AI, it is all based on data. To reduce the hallucination of LLMs and to make LLMs response sensible and meaningful, you need to feed the right context. And this context has to come from existing enterprise data sources. And you need to aggregate and consolidate all the data into one unified data lake, which is going to be your single source of truth. And Microsoft has already announced and built something called Fabric. And Fabric is the data lake, which is essentially an aggregated data platform of both structured data, which typically comes from NoSQL or relational database, and unstructured data, which is coming from your PDF and text documents and OCR based scans and whatnot. So Microsoft Fabric is that unified data lake, which is actually called One Lake, which is going to act as a single source of truth for not just AI, but all things data. Microsoft's vision is to turn that into an all-encompassing unified data platform where customers will pretty much store all their structured and unstructured data. And what's interesting is Microsoft understands that customers have their data already stored in, for example, Amazon S3 or Databricks data lake, or even for that matter Snowflake, which is actually a competitor to Microsoft because it does exactly what Fabric does. But Microsoft has built these connectors and shortcuts, they're actually called shortcuts, which can bring a view of all these data sources into Fabric. And on top of that, you have Power BI, and of course you have copilots and all of that. So it's a very strategic investment, and it is going to be a very solid foundation on which copilots would be built out of. That is one investment. The other one that's very unique to Microsoft is, for a long time, Microsoft has been running Active Directory on the enterprise side, which is now called Microsoft Entra. Now, on the consumer side, there is Microsoft Identity Management, which are actually called Microsoft Accounts, and then Microsoft 365 and Microsoft OneDrive. There is a lot of personal data that's available, Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 and all of that. So Microsoft actually exposed all of that as a unified API called the Graph API. And what it actually means is an ISV who is building a very contextual AI assistant or a copilot can consume this based on your identity and your credentials and can give you highly customized copilot experience, right? For example, you can actually use the copilot to schedule a meeting that doesn't conflict. Now for that, the copilot will have to call the Graph API, access your Outlook calendar and figure out a slot where it can place your schedule or your appointment. Now, when you actually look at these two, Fabric containing your traditional enterprise data and Microsoft Graph containing your personal and very contextual real-time data, you get a very rich data foundation on top of which you can build copilots and the new AI assistants, which will add tremendous value. And I think this is a very unique differentiating factor for Microsoft because no one else in the industry has that kind of a graph API or a knowledge graph and a very rich insight about its users and enterprise customers, and this is going to be a very unique strength of Microsoft.
So if you look at Microsoft before this event and we look at Microsoft now this week, how do you see Microsoft's positions change or evolved, within a week because of these announcements?
This is a significant milestone for Microsoft and its ecosystem. Primarily because of a few things. Number one, Microsoft has now officially entered into the cloud infrastructure business, all the way from infrastructure business as in the hardware and the chips, all the way from CPU to GPU to DPU. That's a big deal. And then it is actually building the entire stack, an end-to-end stack, all the way from silicon to the topmost copilot, giving you an ability to build your own copilots or consume what Microsoft is building as copilots, and then create a very monetizable layer on top of that. And this is very unique. And I think while Google comes very close, this is a very clearly articulated vision and a very opportunistic way of leveraging AI to build a commercial business. And I think this is going to translate into a few $1 billion of Microsoft revenue in the coming years. And this is going to be significant. It's a turning point for Microsoft and its ecosystem.
Awesome. Great analysis there. I wish, as you know, that of course this is not going to happen. There was more consumer-facing hardware also from Microsoft. In addition to just Xbox, I would love to have HoloLenses, Microsoft technologies in our EVs. But this is where we are. Thanks for all those great insights there. And I would love to talk about our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks, Swapnil.